Some people see nature and think, ah yes, the perfect place to test ideas I just invented 5 seconds ago. And somehow, the disasters that follow still manage to surprise them. Trust me, this is only the warm-up. 1. Balancing a pot over an open flame using 2 trekking poles and a suspicious amount of wishful thinking was the masterpiece created by one camper who apparently believed structural engineering works on trust. The moment the pot began to wobble like a toddler on roller skates, he simply whispered, "It'll stabilize," as if the laws of physics respond to gentle affirmations. What he actually built was an accidental catapult that launched his entire dinner into the side of a nearby tree with the confidence of a medieval siege weapon. Instead of accepting defeat, he then declared the explosion of noodles to be for the wildlife, masking the embarrassment of having reinvented the world's least efficient food delivery system. Watching him attempt to salvage the situation by scraping food off bark with a spork added a poetic level of denial, the kind usually reserved for people insisting their DIY haircut just needs to settle. 2. Covering himself in mud for insulation was the choice made by a man who had clearly watched one survival documentary, misunderstood all of it, and then doubled down with absolute conviction. He strolled around the campsite looking like a disgruntled swamp monster who had been fired from his own bog, insisting the mud would regulate his temperature, despite shivering like a phone on vibrate mode. His friends kept suggesting clothing, the normal human solution. But he lectured them about natural living while generating enough dirt crumbles to seed a small garden. When a breeze rolled in, he learned mud is less a heat-preserving layer and more a cold, sticky warning from nature that says, "This is what happens when you pretend to be a potato." By the time he dried and cracked apart like an abandoned art project, he proclaimed success, proving some people would rather freeze than admit a terrible idea was, in fact, terrible. 3. Sealing a tent door with duct tape for weatherproofing was the brilliant invention of a camper whose relationship with problem-solving resembled a toddler's relationship with crayons, enthusiastic, messy, and entirely unconnected to the intended purpose. After struggling with a zipper that stuck slightly, and only slightly, he decided modern fasteners were beneath him and proceeded to mummify the entire tent flap in industrial-strength adhesive. The result looked less like insulation and more like a crime scene undergoing forensic preservation. Unfortunately for him, duct tape is fantastic at trapping things inside, including himself. When he attempted to exit for a bathroom break, all he managed to do was peel the entire structure forward like he was trying to unzip a building. By morning, he'd turned his shelter into a sticky origami sculpture collapsing under its own bad decisions, all while insisting that next time it'll be perfect, which is exactly what people say right before making the same mistake with extra enthusiasm. 4. Placing a metal pot of melting snow directly on his lap seemed like a reasonable lap warmer to a man whose survival instincts were clearly on vacation. He claimed body heat would assist the process, inventing a convection system powered entirely by optimism. What he actually created was a personal hot water hazard that sloshed like an angry aquarium with every slight movement. When the pot inevitably tilted, he performed a full-body flinch that could have qualified as interpretive dance, accidentally redistributing half-melted ice down the front of his pants. Watching him hop around camp while announcing, "It's controlled discomfort," was the high point of the evening for everyone except him. The pot remained undefeated, his dignity remained missing, and the lesson became clear. If your survival hack makes you walk like a caffeinated heron, maybe the hack is doing more surviving than you are. 5. Trying to start a fire with friction by rubbing 2 wet sticks together was the passion project of someone who appeared to believe he could overpower moisture using sheer personality. He confidently quoted something vague about primitive ancestors, ignoring the glaring difference that those ancestors did not choose sticks recently freed from the dishwasher cycle. For 30 uninterrupted minutes, he scrubbed the sticks like he was trying to erase their past. Yet the only smoke generated came from the sheer burning embarrassment radiating off his face. When nothing happened, shockingly, he pivoted to Plan B, blowing on the sticks with the intensity of someone cooling soup for a toddler. Finally, he announced the sticks were too advanced for his technique, as if he'd stumbled upon elite, highly trained wood. Watching him try to maintain eye contact while pretending the sticks had potential was the kind of subtle comedy that belongs in nature documentaries narrated exclusively in size. 6. Using a poncho as a makeshift parachute to descend a small slope was the artistic choice of an individual who mixed up survival skills with extreme sports marketing. He held the poncho above his head like a deflated superhero cape and leapt forward, expecting gentle gliding, blissful floating, and maybe applause from nearby squirrels. Instead, the poncho immediately inverted like a stubborn umbrella in a storm, wrapped around his face, and dragged him downhill in a performance that critics would describe as a laundry bag gaining speed. He emerged at the bottom covered in leaves, ego slightly crumpled, insisting the prototype just needed more airflow, which is also what people say after their inventions reject them in public. The slope was small, his dignity loss was large, and the poncho now refuses to appear in any future stunts without negotiation. 7. Attempting to waterproof boots using candle wax and a hairdryer became the kind of science experiment that would get a failing grade even in a class designed for enthusiastic amateurs. He coated the boots in wax so thick they looked like novelty candles, shaped like disappointment. Then he blasted them with hot air, not noticing the wax melting into strange blobs that resembled modern art displayed in an abandoned gallery. Confident in his victory over moisture, he stepped into a puddle and immediately discovered he had merely created slippery foot prisons that actively encouraged water to join the party. Watching him slide around like he was performing interpretive ice skating in mud was both educational and deeply satisfying. He later declared the boots better suited for dry environments, such as deserts, storage closets, and any place where water fears to go. 8. Storing food in a tree for safety became a disaster when one hiker decided height automatically equals security. Instead of hanging it properly, he simply wedged a large bag of snacks into a branch and congratulated himself like he'd solved wilderness crime. Unfortunately, he forgot trees have residents, particularly a raccoon population with the moral restraint of tiny burglars wearing nature's bandit masks. The raccoons discovered his offering within minutes and conducted a heist so efficient it should have been filmed as a training video. By morning, the bag hung empty, shredded, and somehow insulted. The hiker stood below it, insisting he almost had it figured out, as though the raccoons hadn't outsmarted him using only curiosity and paws designed for chaos. Tree storage works, but only when the tree isn't headlining a raccoon buffet. 9. Using a tarp as an all-weather multi-utility coat was the visionary idea of a camper who believed the boundary between clothing and equipment was fictional. He wrapped himself so aggressively he resembled a human burrito auditioning for a survival-themed cooking show. Confidently striding around camp, he proclaimed he had achieved peak efficiency, ignoring the fact that every gust of wind turned him into a kite desperately seeking escape. The tarp flapped, twisted, and at one point attempted to migrate away from him entirely, leaving him spinning in circles like someone fighting a vengeful bedsheet. When rain finally started, water funneled directly down his improvised outfit, converting him into a mobile drainage system with boots full of regret. Yet he insisted it mostly worked, proving that some people measure success solely by their ability to avoid public admission of failure. 10. Marking a trail using crackers was a navigation technique invented by someone who had clearly read the Hansel and Gretel synopsis without grasping any of its themes or outcomes. He broke crackers into carefully spaced pieces, creating a breadcrumb path that would have made sense only in a world without gravity, wind, or wildlife. Within minutes, the local birds, who frankly deserved the snack, obliterated his entire system in a feeding frenzy that could have been narrated by action movie sound effects. He later returned to the trail expecting a comforting line of guidance, but instead found scattered crumbs that looked like the aftermath of a snack-based stampede. When he realized the birds had consumed his entire navigation strategy, he announced the forest was messing with him, which is a bold accusation to make toward a landscape doing its best to ignore him. 11. Filtering water through a t-shirt because it looked cloudy was the invention of a camper who believed fabric is basically a miracle technology. He held the shirt over a cup and poured water through it, while lecturing everyone about primitive filtration systems, conveniently forgetting that t-shirts are not magical purity devices but sweat collectors with branding. The resulting water still looked questionable, now decorated with stray fibers that resembled aquatic confetti celebrating poor decisions. He stared at the cup as if hoping the particles would dissolve out of respect for his effort. When someone suggested boiling the water, he waved them off, insisting the shirt had handled it. Minutes later, he sipped it proudly, immediately regretting everything while still pretending the experience had notes of earthiness. Nothing says confidence like drinking failure and insisting it tastes artisanal. 12. Using a mirror to signal for warmth was the philosophical approach taken by a person who mixed up energy, physics, and maybe every science textbook ever written. He stood in the cold, waving a mirror at the sun like he was trying to flag down celestial customer service, claiming he was redirecting heat toward himself. In reality, he managed to blind half the group, irritate a passing jogger, and create a glare so intense it probably disrupted bird schedules. He continued adjusting the mirror with the seriousness of someone operating high-tech equipment, ignoring the fact that he was basically twirling a shiny rectangle while shivering. When warmth failed to arrive, shockingly, he said the sun was at a bad angle, which is the astronomical equivalent of saying your oven is in a bad mood. 13. Declaring himself one with nature and attempting to track animal footprints despite having zero knowledge of the outdoors, one hiker crouched dramatically over a set of impressions in the dirt that turned out to be his own shoe prints. He followed them with intense concentration, narrating imaginary behavior patterns while the group quietly exchanged glances that said, "Should we tell him?" He became increasingly impressed by the creature's agility, especially when the trail abruptly doubled back, which happened solely because he spun in confusion earlier. Eventually, he reached a point where his tracks overlapped and announced triumphantly that the animal had circled him, unaware he was congratulating himself on being lost in a loop. The moment someone finally explained the situation, he defended his interpretation, proving self-confidence sometimes survives even when accuracy does not. 14. Reinventing snowshoes using pizza boxes was the proud contribution of a person who believed cardboard is stronger in colder climates, as though winter transforms takeout materials into performance gear. He strapped the boxes to his boots using kitchen twine and optimism, then stepped into the snow expecting graceful gliding, smooth distribution, and perhaps applause. Instead, the soggy cardboard collapsed instantly, swallowing his feet like disappointed quicksand. Each step generated a sad squelch that perfectly matched the mood, and the boxes began disintegrating into pulped confetti around his ankles. Still, he persisted, claiming they almost worked, which is technically true in the same way a falling ladder almost stands. The pizza boxes may have failed as footwear, but they succeeded in proving that not all recycling ideas deserve to be tested outdoors. 15. Attempting to create a windbreak by arranging backpacks in a circle, one ambitious camper built what can only be described as a ceremonial shrine to misunderstanding meteorology. He carefully positioned the bags as if inviting the wind to participate in a polite conversation rather than a full-contact sport. The moment a gust hit, the backpacks toppled inward like a reluctant cheerleading squad collapsing out of spite. Undeterred, he rebuilt the circle twice, each time with increasing frustration and decreasing structural integrity. Meanwhile, the wind, being wind, simply continued moving, ignoring his masterpiece entirely. When the bags rolled across camp like confused tumbleweeds, he mumbled that the gusts were strategic, suggesting he believed the weather was personally invested in humiliating him. And honestly, given the performance, who could blame it? 16. Charging into the woods with a solar-powered survival lantern at twilight was the bold strategy of a person who genuinely believed sunlight could be retroactively collected. They waved the unlit lantern like a magical artifact that simply needed enough confidence to turn on, insisting the battery was just resting as the darkness expanded around them like a practical joke. When the lantern refused to so much as flicker, they held it closer to the sky as if the moon might feel charitable and donate a few volts. Eventually, they concluded the lantern had been drained by negative energy, a scientific theory that exists only in yoga studios and poorly written fantasy novels. Meanwhile, the rest of the group watched them stumble through the underbrush, illuminating nothing but their own stubborn pride. By the end of the night, they were navigating using the reflective strip on their shoe, a technique they later described as resourceful, which is certainly one word for refusing to carry actual batteries. 17. Declaring war on mosquitoes using a homemade repellent made from crushed mints and enthusiasm was the tactical decision of someone who thought insects respond to aromatherapy. They dabbed the mixture onto their arms with the seriousness of a battlefield medic administering treatment, proudly announcing the formula came from ancient methods, a claim suspiciously unsupported by any evidence beyond a TikTok comment. Within minutes, the mosquitoes arrived in welcoming formation, apparently delighted to discover their new sugar-coated buffet. Instead of admitting defeat, the Mint strategist insisted the increased mosquito attention only meant the recipe was working too well, which is the verbal equivalent of watching your house burn down and calling it an opportunity for fresh air. Soon they were swatting at the air in a frantic choreography that suggested they were auditioning for a modern dance troupe specializing in panic. The mints melted, the mosquitoes thrived, and the only thing repelled was everyone's confidence in their decision-making. 18. Leaping into action with a thermal emergency blanket cape was the signature move of a camper who believed shiny foil automatically provided superhero abilities. They fastened the blanket around their neck like they were seconds away from rescuing someone from a mild inconvenience and strutted around proclaiming superior insulation while sounding like someone walking through a warehouse full of potato chip bags. When wind hit the cape, it inflated dramatically, turning them into a reflective balloon drifting unpredictably across camp, drawing confused stares from both humans and wildlife. The more the blanket whipped around, the more they insisted it was working perfectly, as if unpredictable flapping were a sign of advanced technology. By the time the blanket wrapped around their face like a judgmental metallic burrito, they were still convinced they'd discovered an innovation in personal heating. The cape didn't retain warmth, but it excelled at amplifying embarrassment, which in its own way is a type of radiant energy. 19. Attempting to cook without fire using body heat and a misplaced sense of optimism, one hiker tucked an entire foil-wrapped burrito under their jacket and announced they were harnessing internal temperature, a phrase that sounds scientific until you watch them constantly check the burrito like a nervous parent monitoring a toddler. After 20 minutes of marinating it against their torso, they unwrapped the result with theatrical flair, discovering it was neither warm nor edible, just damp in a way that raises uncomfortable questions about condensation and culinary dignity. Still, they insisted on taking a bite, describing the flavor as rustic, which is a very charitable interpretation of cold beans seasoned with personal regret. As the group pointed out alternative cooking methods, they defended their technique as fuel-efficient, though it primarily fueled mockery. The burrito, now both physically and emotionally compromised, became a symbol of why not every survival hack deserves a trial run against human skin. 20. Constructing a shelter by leaning branches against a rock and calling it minimalist architecture was the magnum opus of a person whose design influences appeared to be cardboard forts and overconfident squirrels. They placed each branch with exaggerated care, admiring the structure like it was moments away from being featured in a magazine devoted to terrible ideas marketed as rustic charm. Unfortunately, the first gust of wind transformed their masterpiece into a collapsing xylophone of falling timber, leaving them staring at the rubble with the expression of someone betrayed by their own Pinterest board. Rather than acknowledging the failure, they blamed humidity, a meteorological scapegoat frequently used by people inventing excuses on the fly. Once rebuilt, the shelter sagged inward like it was tired of existing, which made sense, given the builder looked equally exhausted by reality contradicting their imagination. In the end, the rock provided more shelter than the structure, demonstrating once again that nature remains undefeated in construction. 21. Attempting to navigate using the stars became a memorable performance when someone pointed confidently at a bright satellite and declared it the North Star, launching the group into a navigational detour powered solely by misplaced faith and wishful celestial interpretation. They insisted they had read at least 3 articles about stargazing, though their understanding of astronomy bore striking resemblance to someone identifying constellations based on whichever lights looked vibey. As they marched forward, they checked the sky frequently, as if the heavens might suddenly applaud their effort. Meanwhile, the satellite drifted steadily across the horizon, which should have been a clue that perhaps stars do not travel like impatient commuters. When someone suggested using a compass, they waved it off, calling compasses old-fashioned, despite navigating with confidence built entirely on a moving object, not even in Earth's atmosphere. Eventually, they reached a clearing no one recognized but declared it close enough, cementing a proud legacy of determination triumphing over accuracy. 22. Treating a puddle like a natural mirror to check for hypothermia signs was the medical plan of a person with more faith in water's diagnostic abilities than any healthcare provider. They stared intensely at their reflection, claiming the color of their nose was concerning, though the only thing visible was a distorted ripple that made them look like an abstract painting having a rough day. When the puddle slightly froze over, they announced it as a confirmation, as if winter weather were personally evaluating their condition. To increase clarity, they tapped the ice repeatedly, creating a slush that made their reflection resemble a cryptid sighting. Someone offered an actual thermometer, but they declined, insisting the puddle provided holistic insight. Nothing says medical expertise like relying on mud, ice, and self-diagnostics performed while shivering. Ultimately, the only thing showing signs of distress was their decision-making, which recorded dangerously low levels of common sense. 23. Assembling a signal device by tying aluminum cans to a stick and shaking it rhythmically was the communications breakthrough of someone who believed search and rescue teams respond to performances resembling grocery carts being pushed downstairs. They waved the contraption overhead like they were summoning a spirit particularly attracted to recycling centers, and loudly explained that the reflective cans would catch the sun, despite it being cloudy enough to suggest the sun was on its lunch break. When no one responded, they increased the shaking intensity until the cans tangled into a chaotic knot, creating a soundscape better suited for scaring away wildlife and patients simultaneously. They insisted it was just a prototype, which was a polite way of acknowledging the entire device was a metallic tantrum on a stick. As a communication method, it failed spectacularly, but as a warning to everyone nearby that the inventor should no longer be trusted with materials, it worked flawlessly. 24. Attempting to measure distance by counting footsteps like ancient explorers was the proud methodology of a hiker whose stride consistency fluctuated with every rock, slope, and passing existential doubt. They announced each 100 steps with ceremonial triumph, never acknowledging that their pace ranged from confident stomping to delicate tiptoeing depending on how recently they'd tripped. Their calculations grew increasingly chaotic as they adjusted for terrain variable factors, a phrase they said with such seriousness you'd think they were drafting a dissertation instead of walking in circles. When asked how this system accounted for different elevation angles, they muttered something about instinctual compensation, which is survivalist code for "I'll figure it out later," and probably incorrectly. By the time they completed their estimate, the group was no closer to knowing their location, but significantly closer to realizing that sometimes too much enthusiasm is indistinguishable from sophisticated confusion. 25. Lighting a smokeless fire using damp logs and wishful thinking was the innovation attempted by someone determined to outsmart combustion itself. They arranged the logs in a ceremonial pattern that looked impressive from afar but collapsed instantly upon ignition like a wooden house of cards. When the fire coughed out more smoke than a stressed dragon, they waved their hands dramatically and said the logs were releasing moisture aggressively, framing the entire disaster as an emotional outburst from timber. As the smoke thickened, their eyes watered, but they insisted the fire was in the activation phase, a phrase that appears in no survival handbook ever written. Eventually, they crouched beside the flame, whispering encouragement as if the fire lacked self-esteem rather than oxygen. The final product was neither smokeless nor impressive, but it did successfully fumigate the entire campsite, which is a result, just not the one they were aiming for. 26. Attempting to dry soaked clothing by whipping it through the air like a medieval flag ceremony was the energetic solution offered by someone who deeply misunderstood evaporation. They swung each garment overhead with the vigor of a halftime show performer, sending droplets flying in every possible direction, including back onto themselves. As the display continued, the clothes became no drier, but gained impressive velocity, eventually slapping against a tree with the dramatic flare of a surrender flag. They insisted the technique accelerated airflow, ignoring that the only acceleration happening was their own exhaustion. When someone suggested hanging the clothes, they dismissed it as passive drying, apparently preferring methods that turned laundry into a competitive sport. Ultimately, the whipping produced nothing but winded pride and an accidental demonstration of why humans don't typically solve moisture problems through interpretive dance. 27. Attempting to navigate fog by shouting echo checks into the mist was the auditory strategy of a hiker convinced they could map the landscape using noise like an off-brand bat. They hollered dramatically, then waited with exaggerated anticipation for a reply that never came, interpreting the silence as complex topography instead of the simplest possible explanation. Fog doesn't respond. With each shout, they rotated slightly, accidentally disorienting themselves further while announcing conclusions such as "There's definitely a ridge nearby," or "I think the valley curves left," based entirely on emotional interpretation rather than acoustics. When someone suggested using a GPS, they rejected the idea, calling it too digital, apparently believing the weather prefers analog communication. After several rounds of shouting into moisture, they proudly stated they had triangulated a route, which led directly to a patch of identical fog roughly 10 feet from where they began. The mist remained silent, presumably out of politeness. 28. Attempting to build a natural cooler by burying drinks in shallow soil was the creative contribution of someone who believed the ground fundamentally respects beverage storage. They dug a small hole, placed the cans inside with reverence, and patted the dirt over them like burying treasure for future generations of disappointed archaeologists. When the drinks emerged hours later, not chilled but slightly warmer, as if they'd been incubated, they claimed the soil had undergone a thermal shift, giving nature responsibility for a decision they'd made independently and poorly. Undeterred, they insisted the trick worked in certain climates, though the climate in question remains unidentified and possibly fictional. As the warm cans were passed around, the group tasted the unsettling flavor of hope evaporating. Meanwhile, the inventor took notes for future modifications, proving nothing motivates a poor idea like doubling down on its potential. 29. Attempting to track time by watching shadows despite frequent cloud cover was the chronometric strategy of someone determined to prove that nature itself could function as their personal wristwatch. They positioned a stick in the ground, then crouched beside it like a devoted apprentice awaiting divine scheduling cues. Every time sunlight briefly appeared, they scribbled notes with frantic urgency, treating each beam like limited edition information. When clouds lingered, they frowned accusingly at the sky, as though meteorology were conspiring to sabotage their outdoor calendar. Their time estimates quickly drifted into surreal territory, announcing that mere minutes had passed during what was objectively half an hour. When challenged on the inaccuracy, they defended the method passionately, claiming it required interpretive skill, which, yes, is one way to describe guessing. The stick, forever trapped in its role as an uncooperative assistant, cast no opinions, much like everyone else trying to ignore the mounting absurdity. 30. Attempting to scare off a bear by singing loudly was the musical intervention of a hiker whose playlist apparently included songs to confuse wildlife. They belted out melodies with the confidence of someone auditioning for a show that would absolutely not cast them, modulating their voice in a way that suggested they thought bears respect vocal range. The bear, utterly unbothered, looked at them with the weary expression of a commuter hearing a street performer after a long day. Undeterred, the singer increased volume and enthusiasm, shifting genres twice in hopes that the bear merely had specific musical preferences. When the bear wandered off, likely searching for peace rather than fleeing fear, the singer declared victory and credited their commanding stage presence. Meanwhile, the rest of the group quietly agreed the bear had demonstrated excellent taste by leaving immediately. 31. Attempting to dry matches by holding them over a steaming cup of instant noodles was the tactical masterpiece of someone who believed humidity works in reverse if the food smells good enough. They hovered the matchbox above the rising steam like a priest blessing a sacred artifact, waiting for the moment the damp matches would spontaneously regain competence. Instead, the steam soaked the cardboard further, rendering the matches so soft they resembled miniature sponges wearing red hats. Still, the inventor attempted to strike one, generating nothing but a sad, mushy crumble that perfectly represented the emotional state of everyone watching. When confronted with the failure, they blamed low-quality manufacturing, refusing to acknowledge that noodle vapor is not a recognized drying method in any realm of reality. The noodles, at least, cooked properly, proving that out of the two things being heated, only one of them had any intention of working. If this is humanity's survival strategy, I'm amazed trees haven't filed complaints. Drop your favorite disaster in the comments and vote for the dumbest. Like, subscribe, and brace for the sequel.